Propaganda is the spread of information or ideas in a distorted fashion in order to influence people's opinions. It may not give all the facts, and those it does give are carefully selected to support its view, or it may emphasize only one way of looking at something, or give one side of an argument. It may well use emotive language in order to produce an emotional rather than a rational response. It's used to put a positive spin on something. Propaganda is released by organisations representing a specific view or else a particular objective, political parties and pressure groups, but also by governments. The key thing is that it only gives a partial view, and it is most certainly not balanced. Propaganda in itself is not a wicked thing. It is used in democracies, as well as single-party states and dictatorships. Political parties ply us with propaganda, saturating us with it at election times, and you might expect more of democratic governments, though you'd be disappointed. But even here, when trying to explain the benefits of a piece of legislation they propose, they will try to sell it to the public. One-party authoritarian states, of course, are much more heavy-handed. This is because they seek a complete and lasting social revolution. They aren't setting out to tamper with society, but to turn it upside down. Theirs would be a radical revolution, and they need to control it every step of the way, and either take the people with them, or else, as we've seen in another presentation, remove them from society. In one-party authoritarian states, then, propaganda is about taking the people with them, converting them or indoctrinating them to their movement, making believers out of them. As Goebbels himself put it, the essence of propaganda consists in winning people over to an idea so sincerely, so vitally, that in the end they succumb to it utterly and can never escape from it. In this presentation, I'll look at how the Nazis organised themselves and how their message was presented. In the early years of the Nazi Party, Hitler himself had been responsible for propaganda. He had studied the use made of it in Viennese politics when he lived there. He was very clear about how propaganda should work. A very few simple points encapsulated in a simple, catchy slogan and repeated over and over again, all suggesting a low opinion of the intelligence of the average German. But in power, Joseph Goebbels was appointed Minister of Propaganda and National Enlightenment. I love that last choice of word. And he was to prove to be one of the great successes of the Nazi regime. Indeed, it should be said right at the outset here that the Nazis proved themselves the masters of propaganda. Just how much it did, in fact, influence the German people is a matter for debate and another presentation. But that they knew what they were doing is not in doubt. In order to make sure every part of German culture was carefully controlled, Goebbels formed separate chambers within the ministry for newspapers, radio, film, theatre, music, literature and art. Germans wanting to work in these areas had to become members of the chamber, and that membership depended on giving support to the Nazi movement. Censorship was also a tool that was used. Jewish, socialist and any unfriendly newspapers were closed down. Magazines and journals too, so that by 1938 half of them had been closed. And the editor's law of October 1933 made editors personally responsible for their paper's content, which left them acting as the party's censors. Also, Nazi versions of major events were handed to newspaper editors for printing in their papers, and to radio programmers for their broadcasts. These could be quite detailed. For example, what to say about Hitler, what photographs can and cannot be used when depicting leading Nazis. As for literature, every book required the ministry's authority before it could be published. The kind of subjects the Nazis favoured included books about race, vilifying the Jew, the glory of war and the heroic German on the battlefield, the glory of the Nazi movement too. The works of over 2,500 writers were officially banned. It was much the same with theatre. The content of plays needed to fit with Nazi ideals. The books of authors hostile to Nazi ideals or the works of Jews were removed from public libraries. In May 1933, Berlin students set fire to a huge pile of 20,000 such books, and this was repeated across Germany. Jewish composers were also banned, as was jazz or Negro music. Radio was a very important means of receiving news in the 1930s. Consequently, the Nazis produced a cheap radio, known as the People's Receiver, and an even cheaper version, the German mini receiver. And as a result, the number of radios in German homes shot up to over 16 million by the 1940s, so that 70% of households had a radio, more than in America. Radios and speakers were also placed in factories and cafes, and loudspeakers installed in squares and on streets. The message had to reach the people. The Nazis set up the Reich Radio Company, which controlled all local radio stations, and listening to the BBC carried a death penalty. The People's Receiver was unable to receive foreign stations. As he would do with the cinema, Goebbels made sure that many of the programmes on the radio were entertaining. Otherwise, people would literally turn off. There were programmes on German history, though, and community programmes. Children were not forgotten either, and there were programmes to encourage them to serve their communities as well as their country. And in his first year as Chancellor alone, Hitler made 50 broadcasts. Many more would follow. Orders were given to factories, big department stores, offices, shops and pubs, blocks of flats too, to make sure that access to a radio or a loudspeaker was made available for his more important speeches. Cinema had become very popular, and overall, cinema attendances in Germany reached 1 billion by the end of the 1930s. Foreign films were shown, but they were carefully censored. The Nazi film industry produced around 100 films a year. But as with the radio, Goebbels was astute enough to accept that if they were all filled with blatant propaganda, the German people would quickly become cynical and bored and would simply stop attending the cinemas. Therefore, he was careful to make sure that most of the films produced were the normal fare of love stories, comedies, or else adventure films, though others did have nationalist, racial, as well as military themes, and anti-communist and pro-Nazi themes too. The Eternal Jew, an anti-Semitic documentary, is a famous example of film used as blatant propaganda. Triumph of the Will and the Olympia films were famous examples of films used to show the Nazi movement and its achievements in a positive light. While the newsreels which preceded feature films in the cinema were also full of the greatness of Hitler and the massive achievements of Nazi Germany. In Nazi Germany, almost everything could be seen in propaganda terms. The Nazis, in trying to develop a new German culture, also introduced a new calendar of festivals and days to celebrate, days in which people were expected to attend parades and listen to speeches. These included the Day of Seizing Power, with torchlight parades on January the 30th, Hitler's birthday on April the 20th, or German Culture Day in July, while the Mother's Cross was given to German women with 5 or more children on August the 12th, Hitler's mother's birthday. The Nuremberg rallies were used to highlight the power of the Nazi movement. The Nazis used marches, particularly torchlight nighttime marches, which were especially powerful in cities and towns, even quite small towns, across Germany, to show a sense of order, discipline and power. The 1936 Olympics, which was staged in Berlin, was used to demonstrate German greatness now that the Nazis were in control. Even architecture was used to demonstrate German power to outsiders and the power of the state to Germans. Now, I provide really useful detail of all these things in my ebook on Amazon, but it would be too much for a presentation like this. But I do have time, as always, I hope, to thank you for listening and wish you the best of luck in your studies. I do hope you found this presentation useful. Cheers.